Want to, if you have.
Hello and welcome to Shaka Xtra Time, the only show where we answer your questions about politics in Africa. I'm Jackson Vunganyi, host of Upfront. I'm filling in for Paul Ndiho, and with me is Peter Clotty, host of Nightline Africa. Shaka is on assignment. Hello, Peter. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you.
Good to have you in the hot seat. So a lot of questions have come in from our listeners and fans of Shaka. Hopefully you're ready to answer some of the tough questions coming out of the continent. We'll start off, I think the basis of of some of the questions will be some of the interviews that you've covered over the weekend on your show Nightline, where you cover a lot of African politics. And let's start off with Namibia. They just had an election. The president, Hage Geingob, was re-elected to his second term and hopefully his final term with 56.3%. The last one, this was a sharp drop from the last one where he won by 86%. Right. What are you getting from your listeners about the elections? What do they feel? Do they feel like this was a free and fair election just based on the numbers? I mean, the sharp drop from 56, we're used to a continent where leaders win by 90, 99%, 56.3%. Does that tell you something about how the election went?
Well, I spoke with the CEO of the Electoral Commission who expressed confidence that the elections were free, fair, transparent, and credible, and that the opposition groups were allowed to be part of the process to ensure transparency and credibility. However, the opposition groups are saying there were sharp differences in some of the polling data from the polling stations to the figures announced by the Electoral Commission of Namibia, also known as ECN. Right. So
you spoke to some opposition figures about this?
Yes, I did. And one of the things they were doing was to meet and then come up with a strategic position. I spoke with Mark Henry Venani, the main opposition leader of the Popular Democratic Front, or PDM, and they were of the view that they have to challenge the outcome of the election because they thought there was something fishy going on and that the Electoral Commission did not actually give them the free will to participate fully in the electoral process. However, the interesting thing is that the guy who came in second, position 2, who had 30% of the vote, is from the ruling SWAPO party.
Interesting.
Now, he did not like what was going on in the SWAPO party, so he decided to go independent. Yeah. The court heard a case where SWAPO went to court and said he should be disbarred. He's a member of our party.
We should not be running against. Right. Yeah, we have already a party candidate we chose.
But the court said it is his constitutional right
to run.
To run.
And challenge the president.
So he did. And that was what caused the sharp decline in the president's figures. However, before the election, there were acts of corruption where the fisheries minister and those in the fisheries department were alleged to have committed acts of bribery and corruption, financial malfeasance to be exact. And that is why it caused President Geingob to lose that amount of vote. Secondly, there was a huge drought in the Southern African region, particularly in Namibia, and there was an economic contraction, which really did not go well for Hage Geingob, and that is why his numbers suffered greatly.
Now, interesting the way you, some of those situations or circumstances that led to the decline of his numbers, some of which has to do with corruption and, weather conditions or climate conditions in that part of the region. But leading up to the elections, because we know around the continent, there's a lot of turmoil in the days leading up to the election. We see police being deployed on the streets, crackdown on the opposition. How was it in Namibia?
See, Namibia has been pretty free from politically related violence. The only concern opposition people had was that part of the country were kept underdeveloped. So the ruling party with its resources...
The allocation of resources was not equal.
So they go there, promise them, give them a lot of money and say, hey, we're giving you these products and money. If you want for it to continue, you vote for us. If you don't vote for us, this one will be cut short.
Dry out,
right?
For lack of a better term.
So those were some of the criticisms the opposition leaders held at the ruling party. The interesting thing too is that you have Mrs. Esther Alice Mwigandre. She is the only female presidential candidate for the first time to contest in the presidential election in Namibia since the country gained independence
How did she do?
30 years ago. Well, she didn't do quite well because of perception. However, people said she performed...
Still, it was historical.
Right. And that she is an ambassador for women to speak on women issues. The opposition party that elected her, she beat a lot of men in the party to run as a presidential candidate. I had the pleasure of speaking with her, and she was confident. I will go back to talk to her again and see how things were.
But she said the election, she was sure she was going to.
She said even if she doesn't perform well, it is one shot in the glass ceiling in Namibia. So let's see how it goes.
Absolutely. Now, best again on some of the history that we've seen on the continent, political history. Political leaders, presidents come in and, you know, promise to run for the constitutional mandated 2 terms, and then at the end of the 2nd term, they change the election. Do you see this happening in Namibia? What is the history, the political history of Namibia, and what does that tell you about, you know, going forward in this last term of Mr. Geingob?
See, interestingly, Namibia is quite a different country because you had a leader who led the SWAPO party to independence. His name is Sam Nujoma.
Yes.
Now, Sam Nujoma, after serving 2 terms, he relinquished power willfully, handed over peacefully. Then you had Hifikepunye Pohamba, and then from Hifikepunye Pohamba, you had somebody else, and then Hage Geingob came. Now, Hage Geingob at the time was stateless because at that time, when they were fighting to become independent, the government occupying the country at that time, you know, canceled all his documents. So he didn't have any country. He was stateless. Now he came back after over 30 years. He had not seen his homeland. He came back. He served in very important capacities. He served as a minister. And then they chose him. So it is with the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Affairs Minister. Her name is Netumbo Nandi Ndaitwah, who was then Information Minister. And people are projecting that she could be the next president of Namibia. So let's see how that goes.
All right, let's move away from Namibia. So many questions coming in from our viewers and listeners. One question from Tumwebaze Usifu. I'm assuming he's from Uganda. Question is, does the African Union still exist? We know it does exist, but I guess symbolically, I guess he meant if actually still, you know, does the work of, as he says, you're promoting democracy and the rule of law in Africa. What is your take on how the African Union has performed so far? At least in the last 5-10 years when we've seen so many major reforms happening in the African Union.
You know, the African Union has come up with a blanket statement of non-tolerance or zero tolerance for the violent overthrow of an administration, or coup d'etat, as some people call it. And it has been promoting the tenet of democracy to be embraced by member countries. So it usually sends its poll observers to go and monitor elections as part of the process. However, the criticism being leveled against the African Union is that they have a template of what they are going to do when they get there.
Right.
And in spite of challenges, they said, well, the election was peaceful, transparent, and credible, and they go away.
Right.
You know, so it's pretty...
So regardless of how the election turns out, they will always read from the same script.
Those are the criticisms leveled against, because in some instances, you have the European Union Poll Observer Mission say, this election was suspect, there were challenges here and there. For example, in the Nigerian concept, the European Union and some international poll observer groups said there were challenges in some of the areas where, for example, in Lagos, where some opposition people were beaten, there were violence, politically related deaths, about 48 that the government figures showed. However, the African Union did not go that far. And those are some of the criticisms leveled against the African Union. But It's a process. Let's see how it goes.
Right.
The African Union, since it transformed itself from the Organization of African Unity, seemed to have shifted a little focus by embracing the tenet of democracy, except the other criticism is that it is opposed to what they said, targeting of Africans by the International Criminal Court, of which the International Criminal Court says that it is not targeting Africans because Africans themselves, these African countries, take these matters to them.
Absolutely.
You know, so it is not their fault, and that those who commit gross human rights violations should stop. And by stopping, you don't bring the cases to us, and then we don't adjudicate over those cases. So these are some of the things that are ongoing.
Right, and you know, some of the criticism has always been that the African Union is just a cabal of leaders who look out for each other, and that they won't do anything to you or condemn you or chastise you if you been, you know, said to have either, you know, committed election malfeasance.
Yeah, but there have been instances where the African Union have tried to mediate to try to bring to an end a conflict, for example, in South Sudan, where they pushed IGAD and supporting IGAD so that there will be a solution found because of the tension between former Vice President Dr. Riek Machar and President Salva Kiir that has led to a conflict that affected hundreds and thousands of people who have been displaced from their homes. Some have been killed and all that. The African Union has been at the forefront backing IGAD to try to resolve this issue because it's gone on for far too long. And I have seen instances where there has been an intervention, they've sent people. Example in Cameroon, where you have the Ambazonia crisis or the English-speaking crisis, where thousands of gendarmerie, thousands of security operatives are sent to the English-speaking areas where these people, separatists as they call them, terrorists as the government calls them, are trying to establish an independent country to be called Ambazonia. Now you have the African Union chairperson, Mahamat, going there, meeting President Paul Biya, meeting some stakeholders to try to come up with a unique conversation or dialogue without precondition as part of the process to resolve
to find a solution to this problem. So the African Union, for all its criticism, is actually doing some good work.
Absolutely.
And it's quite encouraging. Let's go to our next question. This is from Bevin Nyirongo. And I have a feeling that you've covered this, or you might actually know about this specific issue because it seems to me very specific. What is your opinion on Malanji and U.S. envoy Daniel Foote about corruption in Zambia? Now, is this a story about corruption in Zambia?
It is a story about corruption in Zambia, and it is about LGBT issues as well. Recently, there were two gentlemen who were allegedly caught in the act, and they were reported, they were prosecuted, they were jailed for approximately 15 years. And the U.S. ambassador expressed concern that as the only country that professes to be the only Christian country
on the continent,
of Africa, the Christian doctrine says that you should treat people with compassion. So if somebody is doing, you said, hate the sin, not the person. So they should treat people with LGBT, in the LGBT community, humanely and kindly with compassion. However, he received a lot of backlash. Some people even attacked him on social media platforms. Today, it's supposed to be the 8th day in Zambia. He couldn't go. He said, I can't go because of the verbal attacks and threat he is receiving. But then people are saying if the government will attack him, Malanji is the foreign minister of Zambia. If he will attack him, and he threatened, the foreign minister threatened to send a letter to Washington complaining about the behavior, so to speak.
Interfering in internal politics of the country.
So he's saying, a lot of Zambians are saying, why are you attacking this man with such vigor? But when he spoke about corruption in the government, why are you not saying anything about it?
So at some point, the ambassador, his name is Daniel Foote, had spoken out against corruption in Zambia.
Absolutely.
And the foreign minister or whoever, other leaders in Zambia had not come out as ferocious as in this case.
And when I spoke with President Edgar Lungu, when I sat down with him, we had an interview, he was of the view that he is fighting corruption. The opposition thinks he
doesn't believe.
And then they are saying, he also said that the issues of LGBT issues are not what Zambians embrace, and that he will not or Zambians will not embrace aid in exchange of promoting LGBT issues. So these are some of the issues going on. And it's not only in Zambia. A lot of African countries, apart from South Africa, have been sharply opposed to when issues of LGBT, they say this is not our tradition, and among other issues. But some people are saying LGBT issues are human rights issues. Some people say they were born that way. Others argue that it's a choice. So the debate is still ongoing, and there's pushbacks, and they are pull and pull.
So this Foreign Minister Malanji, right now on the issue of Daniel Foot, has he sent that letter to Washington?
Well, I tried reaching him yesterday and today. I haven't been able to reach him, but I spoke with the spokesperson of the president, and he's of the view that this is a foreign relations issue, so the Malanji, who is the foreign minister, is dealing with it. But we'll try to get hold of Mr. Malanji to react to.
So I guess the idea is that they're making a lot of noise to mask something, which is like
that is what the opposition is saying.
They're willing to talk about this, but not about corruption.
Absolutely, right. That's what the opposition is saying.
All right, good. Let's go to our next question, and this is a question from. Let me go to Griffin Mills. What are your thoughts on African presidents seeking economic support from countries outside of Africa, such as China? I guess that's the question of, some African countries are looking up to the east. China had a very big conference where it's trying to court African countries. Countries are saying, we can go to both the east and the west for, financial aid. This person wants to know what is your feeling on that one? Well,
I've heard arguments pro and otherwise about the issue of African leaders going to China or seeking, monetary support from them, because they believe that there are no conditions about reforms, about democratic reforms,
about human rights,
issues, and that what they want is what they want. However, if you go back in history, African leaders have always sought help from everywhere they could get. When there was the USSR, the Soviet Union, you had some African leaders siding with the Soviet Union based on what they would get.
Right.
Now you had some that came up with what you call the non-aligned movement. They would not align themselves with any of the parties that are in the Cold War. So they played both sides. They got from the West, they got from the Soviet Union and all that. So it's
so basically we don't have a side in this. For us, our side is us.
Yes. We stay in the middle.
Yes.
We will not side with anybody. Absolutely.
Purely business interests.
So this is pretty much not new. Just that because of the rise of China, that's why the focus is so much on China. Now I spoke with the information minister at that time, who is now the deputy president in Namibia. And she was telling me that in a small place like Ojiwarongo is outside Windhoek, the capital, you have a lot of Chinese going on. And when you go to Ghana, it's the same thing. You go to Zambia, there are Chinese Zambians. You go to almost across the continent, you have Chinese doing businesses. Some are saying they should not be allowed into the mom and pop shops, and that they should do bigger projects and not the day-to-day activities that people...
Not competing for the local jobs that are around.
So there's a little tension going on there. And then it appears that there's a second scramble for Africa where a lot of people have said the next frontier is Africa. Africa would determine the future. So you have all these powers going to Africa.
Russia.
There you go.
Right.
There you go. They just organize. Russia just organized an African summit. China did the same thing. Remember when Obama was president? President Obama was the head of state here. He also organized a U.S.-Africa summit
in Washington, D.C.
In Washington, right here. So these are things that are going on. Leaders would have to take advantage.
Are we seeing history repeat itself?
It appears so. It appears so, and that is why citizens are saying, take advantage of what is happening, build institutions, protect the people.
The interest of the country and the people, right.
But sometimes the criticism is that when they get this support, financial support, it does not end up in the project that are anticipated.
Right.
It ends up in individual pockets, and that is why a lot of people express concern about what's
especially if the donor country does not care to see where the money goes, or they don't have all these strings and restrictions and on where the money ends up with. So if it ends up in individual pockets, who cares? At the end of the day, the citizens will pay. And I think that's one of the main criticisms. You're watching Shaka Xtra Time right here on the Voice of America. My name is Jackson Vunganyi. Stepping in for Shaka Sari is Peter Clotty. Peter Clotty is the host of Nightline Africa, and we're still answering your questions, or Peter is answering your questions. Peter, you will be hosting Straight Talk as Shaka is away on assignment. Before we go to the next question, can we talk about what your the topic will be for this week? Yeah,
we'll be talking about disability in Africa. And as the saying goes, disability is not inability. Some of the challenges some of these people who are physically challenged go through in Africa, some of the misconceptions, some of the stigma that they go through, we'll be highlighting some of these things and talking about them, and to find better ways where governments can implement policies to help the difficulties some of these physically challenged people go through in Africa. So these are some of the things that we'll be looking at on Straight Talk Africa.
Very important topic. Very, very important topic. So, Peter, I have a question here from James Ruel Majok. He's from South Sudan. He's asking, what is the way forward for implementation of peace in South Sudan? This is a story you've been covering quite closely. You've interviewed all the protagonists in this story over the years since I think war broke out in South Sudan when it was just 1 year old, as it was celebrating its second year as a country, the youngest country. Like you said earlier, conflict has led to mass displacement and killings and death of people in South Sudan. What is the way forward? Where are the major players right now? Where are we in this conflict?
We are at a stalemate right now. In a day or two, there has to be a revision of the revitalized agreement, because the two main rivals, President Salva Kiir and the former Vice President Riek Machar, extended the pre-transitional period for 100 days. Now, it's come up because they were supposed to implement or establish a transitional government that would lead to a possible election. Now, there has been back and forth. President Salva Kiir was supposed to provide $1 million that will help the opposition military groups to settle. And as part of the settlement, we'll have a united military stance that will help the people of South Sudan. This has not transpired, and that is the core issue. Now, IGAD, the Intergovernmental Regional Bloc, it's supposed to hold their feet to the fire to ensure that they keep to their promises. So far, it's not kept its promises in terms of the underlying ingredients that need to be established before the transitional government is implemented. And now
and which is that? What is the one thing they need to do?
That is the resettling the armed groups. Because if these armed groups are restless, of course you're going to have conflict. And so those are some of the things that need to be urgently addressed. The SPLM-IO is accusing the government of not fully committing to bringing the money, because that's what the key issue is.
Right. And the money. Here they're driving to what they still have that 100-day window. Right.
Well, it was supposed to be over in the next few days.
Right.
So we will see.
But do you remember when they announced that 100 days, everybody was a little skeptical, like, you know, it doesn't seem a little, you know, it doesn't seem feasible.
So a lot of people are calling for international pressure on the government in Juba to do what it needs to do to move the process forward. Because once you postpone it, you are giving the element who would want this peace deal not to succeed.
Well, the conflict to continue. Yes,
so that is the problem.
And I saw something from for the SPLM-AO saying that Dr. Riek Machar is under detention.
Well, he has been under detention or confinement by IGAD operators, because they don't want him.
In which country?
Well, it was in South Africa. Now he's in Khartoum in Sudan. The reason being that the accusation by Juba is that he tried to overthrow the government, which led to the conflict in the first place. So we'll try to restrain him.
To contain him where he is.
And then we try to resolve this before a unity government is formed. Now, the SPLM-IO is saying that, why are you restricting his movement? Not only that, he is not required to speak to the media. So all the talks that are happening are coming from the Juba side, where he's been prevented his fundamental human rights to express his opinion about the revitalized agreement and what needs to be done for it to be established, for a transitional government to be implemented.
Wow, that's going to be a little interesting to watch in the next couple of days as they come to the, I guess, to the timeline that was established, the 100-day timeline. We're coming to the end of our show today, but before we go, Peter, real quick, I think we should go to this question from Rita Lobo, and I want you to make it short because we don't have a lot of time.
Right.
Why are African politicians more interested in winning election than in development?
Well, I've heard some people say that because the presidency, for example, in Africa, has too much power. It has unbridled power, whatever the president wants. Unbridled, yes. Yeah. Whatever the president wants, he gets or she gets. And it's rare for a member of the ruling party in parliament to vote against the wishes of the president because your political career is literally over. So until some of those powers are dissolved into parliament or into other branches of government, then you will have the focus on the people and not necessarily the leaders of the country.
So creating a systems of checks and balances,
right,
strengthening
and building institutions right,
that can check the presidency. But at this point, most leaders in their countries are like kind of overlords or kings.
It remains to be seen if these institutions will be implemented and strengthened to check on their powers.
In the next 2 minutes, are there any countries on the continent you've seen in the past 5 years that have actually done the right type of work in terms of establishing these institutions that check the presidency?
It's difficult to say, apart from South Africa and a handful of countries, perhaps in Botswana and Ghana, and in some instances Senegal. Other countries are struggling to come along. Nigeria, for example, is trying to do the same. So let's hope other countries will follow.
Absolutely. That's very, very interesting take on that. Peter, thank you very much for joining us. Everybody who has been watching Shaka Extra Time, my name is Jackson Vunganyi. That was Peter Clody. Watch the show Straight Talk Africa tomorrow, Wednesday. Peter will be hosting, and I think the whole month of December you'll be hosting. And you can follow Peter's show, Nightline Africa. Is always on VOA News on Saturdays and Sunday, where he hosts a very interesting show, Nightline Africa. You can listen to me at Upfront. The show is on Wednesdays, 17:30 UTC, and we'll catch you next time right here on Shaka Extra Time. Goodbye.